There is a tool sitting on your table right now that was once considered an instrument of the devil. Not a knife, not a weapon of any kind. A fork. The assumption most people carry is simple. Forks are ancient, obvious, and universal. Humans have always needed something to lift food to their mouths. Surely the fork arrived alongside fire and the wheel, a basic solution to a basic problem. It did not. For most of recorded human history, people ate with their hands, with bread used as a scoop, or with a knife and spoon. The fork, as a personal dining implement, was, for centuries, considered unnecessary at best, and morally suspect at worst. Its path from curiosity to cultural cornerstone is one of the stranger journeys any everyday object has made. The need the fork eventually answered was not a new one. People had always faced the challenge of moving hot, slippery or sauced food from a shared vessel to their mouths without burning themselves or making a mess. Knives could spear solid pieces. Bread could absorb liquid. Fingers managed everything else. This system worked well enough that it persisted across civilizations for millennia. It was not a gap waiting to be filled. It was a settled arrangement that most people saw no reason to disturb. Large forks existed in ancient kitchens and at sacrificial altars. They were tools for handling meat over fire, for carving, for serving at scale. But these were implements of labor and ritual, not personal dining tools. The leap from the cooking fire to the individual place setting was not obvious, and it was not quick. The idea that each person at a table deserved their own small pronged instrument for lifting food was, for a very long time, simply not part of how people thought about eating. The earliest documented use of a personal dining fork in the Western record appears in the Byzantine Empire, where small two-tined golden forks were used by members of the imperial court. When a Byzantine princess brought this habit to Venice around the turn of the 11th century, upon her marriage to a Venetian doge, the reaction was not admiration. It was condemnation. Clergy criticized the fork as an expression of excessive refinement, an affront to the natural instruments God had provided. The argument, recorded in historical accounts of the period, was that human fingers were the appropriate tools for eating, and that to introduce a golden device between the hand and the food was a kind of vanity, even impiety. When the princess died young of an illness, some contemporary voices framed her fate as divine judgment on her affectations. This was not a fringe position. It reflected a genuine cultural logic. In a world where the body was understood as a creation with a specific moral order, altering the natural manner of eating carried symbolic weight. The fork was not just a utensil, it was a statement about the self, about refinement, about distance from the common and the natural. To use one was to announce something about who you thought you were, and in the 11th century, that announcement was not welcome. For several centuries after that Venetian episode, the fork remained a rarity in Western Europe. It appeared occasionally in the inventories of royalty and wealthy merchants, listed alongside jewels and plate as a luxury object rather than a practical tool. It was something to own, perhaps to display, not necessarily to use at every meal. Its presence in a household said more about wealth and curiosity than about any change in how people actually ate. The transformation began slowly in Italy during the Renaissance, where the culture of the table was becoming a subject of serious attention. Manuals on courtly behavior began to address dining etiquette in detail, and the fork began to appear in these discussions as a marker of civilized conduct. To eat with a fork was to signal membership in a particular social world. The same object that had once been condemned as vain was now being reframed as a sign of cultivation. From Italy, the habit spread northward and westward, but unevenly and against resistance. In France and England, the fork was initially met with mockery. Men who used forks were sometimes ridiculed as effeminate or pretentious. The English traveller Thomas Coriat, who encountered forks in Italy in the early 17th century and brought the practice back to England, was reportedly teased for it. The nickname he acquired, Furcifer, was not entirely affectionate. The very gesture of lifting food on a small pronged instrument struck many observers as unnecessary theatre. What changed was not a single invention or decree. It was a gradual shift in what the table meant. As dining became more formalized, as the shared trencher gave way to individual plates, as the distance between diners and their food increased both literally and symbolically, the fork found its function. It was the instrument of that distance. It allowed a person to eat without touching, to remain composed, to perform a kind of bodily self-governance that the emerging culture of manners increasingly demanded. The fork did not create that culture, but it became one of its most visible tools. The number of tines changed over time. Two-tined forks were common early on. Four tines became standard in much of Europe by the 18th century, offering better stability for a wider range of foods. The shape of the tines, the curve of the handle, the weight and balance of the instrument were all refined across generations of silversmiths and later manufacturers. What had begun as a golden novelty at a Byzantine court was slowly becoming an engineered object, optimized through use. By the 19th century, the fork had not only been accepted, but had multiplied. The Victorian table set included forks for fish, for salad, for dessert, for oysters, for fruit. Each course had its designated implement. The fork had gone from a single suspicious novelty to an entire family of specialized tools, each one a small assertion of social knowledge. To know which fork to use and when was itself a form of cultural literacy. Getting it wrong was a legible mistake, and getting it right was a quiet signal of belonging. What survived into the modern table is a simplified version of that Victorian elaboration. Most settings today include 2 or 3 forks at most. The fish fork and the oyster fork have largely retreated to formal occasions. The basic implement, 4 tines, moderate length, has become so standard that it is nearly invisible, which is precisely what the early critics feared. Not that the fork would be dangerous, but that it would become unremarkable. That the distance it represented would stop feeling like a choice and start feeling like nature. The fork won not because it was obviously necessary, but because the culture around it changed to make it so. It became the instrument of a particular idea about eating, about the self, about what it meant to be civilized at a table. The clergy who condemned it were not wrong that it carried meaning. They were simply on the losing side of a very long argument. And the argument was never really about the fork. It was about what kind of creature a human being was supposed to be at the moment of eating, and how much ceremony that moment deserved. The next time you pick one up without thinking, consider that for several centuries, that automatic gesture was anything but automatic. Someone, somewhere, had to decide that this strange little device was worth the trouble, worth the mockery, worth the theological objection. They had to use it in public, absorb the ridicule, and keep using it anyway. And slowly, one reluctant table at a time, everyone else agreed.